Good morning, everyone. See, people are logging in, so we'll just give it a minute so people can get their audios connected. Really excited for our conversation today. Thank you all for joining us.
Good morning, everyone. I love that there are a couple of repeat attendees. Sam, I'm looking at you. Thank you so much for attending both sessions. I love that folks are in conference rooms. Hello to the numerous people in the conference rooms. Good morning. I hope you're all having a good morning. I know some of us are multitasking, so I appreciate you giving me some of your attention today.
All right, we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Shalisha Edwards. I'm a performance improvement consultant and one of the co-chairs for the Inclusion Committee alongside Patricia Tweedy, who is also on this call. I do want to give a shout out and thank you to our Inclusion Committee members who have been really helpful at selecting our speaker today and for also choosing our topic. Thank you so much for your support in this. Also, for some context, we as a committee, we're looking for a thought-provoking conversation and wanting to learn more about allyship, how we can show up as a better ally, how we can show solidarity. And if you've ever wondered to yourself, what can I do in my small purview or big purview to make a change in the workplace, this is a conversation for you and really appreciate you tuning in. Dr. Tran is an activist, author, speaker, and consultant, and so she is the best person to lead us through this conversation today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Shalisha. I'm so excited to be here with you folks to have this conversation. I hope it is thought-provoking. I think it is a slightly controversial topic. And so I'm hoping we can go in that direction of asking messy questions, maybe asking those questions that don't necessarily have easy answers. That's my hope for today. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and share just a little bit of background and context into this conversation, why you are having it today with me. So my name is Kim, my pronouns are she and hers. I have been doing exactly this, bringing diversity, equity, inclusion into organizational spaces for about 14 years. I cut my teeth in this context, actually. So a number of years ago at the beginning of my career, I was helping a core number of staff build a mental health care program for LGBTQ youth. And in that role, I worked predominantly with clinical care providers to really think about what it meant to create belonging, inclusion, and competent care for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer youth. Since that point, our practice has grown. I'm the co-founder of Tran Consulting. We specialize in working with folks like you, social impact organizations that do phenomenal work in the world. We're just looking to bring you into alignment internally with your dynamics around your values. Everything that we do is research-backed and oriented, and that is in large part because we're a bunch of nerds here at DNT. I have my PhD from UC Berkeley in a field called ethnic studies. I'm a trained sociologist, and I specialize in thinking about the intersection between protest movements, social protest movements like that for civil rights, and organizational change. So what that really looks like on an everyday basis for most of us who spend our working days living, breathing, and eating at work. My book is forthcoming on the topic of allyship and solidarity. It's titled We Could Be, and it should be out next year from Haymarket Press, if my editor has anything to do with it. It will be out next year from Haymarket Press. So really introducing myself is a means of introducing the topic and hoping that you feel comfortable either using that private message function in the chat or using your voice and coming on live. I know some of you are in conference centers and conference rooms to ask questions about the difference between allyship and solidarity. And I guess I'd love to start there. Do we think that there's a difference between allyship and solidarity? And do you have any questions about the difference between allyship and solidarity? Or maybe you've never heard of solidarity before, and you're curious about what the genesis of that framework is, where it comes from, anything along those lines. So I'll start with you. Any questions that folks in the room have on the relationship between allyship and solidarity. Also really excited to hear a question like, I've never heard of this difference before. They seem like the same thing. Any brave souls? Also, feel free to use that chat function throughout this session, folks, if that feels a little bit more comfortable to you. Questions
Also,
or
you
comments?
have the ability to message Kim directly in case you get a little shy in the group chat.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we can just jump right in. All right, folks, let's get started. So we have a pretty straightforward agenda today. We just started with introductions, a little bit about me, a little bit about your context and why we're having this conversation today. We're going to move through a couple of definitions, particularly in response to a case study in a hospital setting, and then we'll do Q&A, and those questions are really flexible. If you've got questions on top of the ones that I'm asking, please feel free to ask them at any point in time. I've got a question in the chat that said, or a comment rather in the chat that says, I didn't realize there was solidarity versus allyship in this context. Alfredo, can you say a little bit more? Did you not realize that solidarity was a concept, or did you not realize that they were different?
This is not Alfredo, but I did respond. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, who is this?
This is Clarissa. Good morning.
Hi, Clarissa. Good morning. Clarissa, go ahead and take it away.
No, I didn't realize that there was such a thing as solidarity in this context. So, I mean, I've heard of allyship, but not solidarity. So that's my comment.
That's a great point. So allyship is something that I think we've become really familiar with, right? Allyship is a concept that kind of arose around the same time as a lot of folks started to think about privilege. Around the 80s and 90s. When you start thinking about privilege, obviously there's something you have to do with that privilege, whatever privilege you might have, right? And that's where allyship really comes in. And I want to start by saying privilege is not bad. Everybody has privilege in some way, shape, or form. And I really hope that you do. And I know that you do, because there is no most oppressed person or no most oppressed group. Everyone, irrespective of the body that they live in, the group that they come from, the background that they have, has some form of privilege that they can use as an ally. And that's why we have a conversation about privilege. It's so that we can be effective allies. To move from allyship to solidarity requires a little bit of forethought and a little bit of strategy. And the reason we think about solidarity as a practice that evolves out of allyship is because solidarity is, we'll get to the definition in a moment here. Solidarity is really marshaling your power, your capacity, your skills in a tactical, strategic way to create long-lasting change. And it can be very different from allyship in specific ways. And I want to get into that now because we're talking about it already. So let's talk about allyship. Allyship is a relationship. It's built on trust, transparency, willingness, and humility. It's focused on actionable equity for communities that are the most impacted by oppression. I'm going to pause here and ask folks, are there any words that stand out to you in that definition of allyship? You can also throw that in the chat here. I want to thank Clarissa for getting us started. Any words that stand out to you in that definition of allyship? Or maybe this is completely different from your definition of allyship. I'd love to hear that as well, if this is not what you anticipated. I'm trying to get you to interact with me, and that's okay. It's okay if we're feeling a little bit shy this morning. So allyship is at the end of the day, about a relationship that we have, either with individuals or with a community to which we don't belong, right? So first and foremost, allyship can be about, how do I create more equity, more belonging, for a community that is not my own. So you're already working across difference. And that relationship is built on trust between the two of you, whether it's, again, another person or a community. Willingness, you have to be open to action and humble enough to act, right? Humility is what is required to understand that you might not know exactly what this community needs, right? And it's focused on actionable equity. And that means you actually have to do something to acknowledge the fact that there is not equity for a different group of people. And they are the most impacted by oppression. I get a lot of folks who push back against that phrase, most impacted. And I want to put it into context here. Most impacted is not a blanket statement. Most impacted is a statement that is relational and relative, right? So I'm going to give you an example. Am I a person of color? Yes. Am I a woman? Yes. Did I grow up low income? Yes. All of these things are true about my experience. And all of those factors are ways in which I experience marginalization. Sure. But in any particular instance, I might experience privilege as well, right? So one of the examples I have of this is on trash day. When I am walking my dog on trash days, a lot of people put their trash cans on the sidewalk, right? Just like right on the sidewalk. And that's not a problem for me or my dog. Both of us can just move through sidewalks really easily. It is a problem for anyone in a wheelchair. And I didn't really understand this until a good friend of mine, I was living with her at the time, she's in a wheelchair, would tell me, like, we would go for walks together. And she'd be like, the trash cans on trash day are a nightmare. She's a white person. I am not. So both of those things are going to be true at the same time. Am I physically able-bodied? Yes. Am I a person of color? Yes. That is, as an ally, I understand that both of those things are true at the same time. And in this context of trash day, I have the privilege of not being impacted by that, right? So I can use that power, that advantage, to move trash cans out of the way because they don't impact me. I'm not the most impacted by trash cans being in my way on trash day, right? And so that's kind of what allyship requires. It requires that we understand we have a relationship in some way, shape, or form. We're willing to act, and we're focused on actionable equity. So I want to learn about what advantages I have. I'm open to that relationship, and I'm willing to take action, right? Any questions or comments thus far about what allyship is? Questions or comments? And again, feel free to use the chat. Feel free to use the private chat. I'll read your comment out loud. I'll answer the comment, but I won't tell anyone who asks the question. Okay. Again, feel free to ask questions throughout this conversation. Let's think about allyship through the lens of a case study in your context. The young man on the screen is named Alon Payan. And in 2016, Alon Payan was having bouts of disconnecting with reality, right? He had been diagnosed with bipolar a few years before, and he started having hallucinations. As a response to his hallucinations, he started talking to his family. His father is a medical doctor. His brother was a medical student at the time. His brother called, he lives in Houston. His brother called Houston PD and asked them to do a wellness check. If folks are familiar with a wellness check, the police went to his house. He wasn't there. And eventually his father and brother encouraged him to go to the ED to seek treatment for these bouts of disconnecting with reality or potentially psychosis. In advance of him going to the ED, they called ahead of time and said, my son and or brother is coming to the hospital. He's having mental health issues and mental health episodes. He gets in his car, he drives to the hospital, he hits a number of things on the way there. And when he arrives, he crashes into a building, totaling his car. In response, the hospital gives him a muscle relaxant for his pain, which potentially exacerbates his episodes of psychosis. And at some point, someone at the hospital calls a code blue to his room. His doctor comes and finds that there are 20 security guards, 2 of whom are off-duty police. He's been tased repeatedly and shot in the chest. He doesn't die. Eventually, he is charged for assaulting a police officer. And this is one of the examples, I think, of systemic and smaller examples of racial bias and microaggressions that can occur within a hospital setting with deep material consequences, obviously, for the life of this one person. If we look at this case through the lens of allyship, what does it look like? When we apply allyship to this scenario, what might we get? I'm curious for you all. I'm going to pose that at you, or I'm going to pose that to you as people who work within a clinical care setting. How might you think about allyship if this happened at your organization? Where might you begin here? Folks, I will put on my professor hat and force people to ask questions. Please don't make me do that. I hate doing that. So please do ask, where might you start here, folks?
Maybe discussing with colleagues, kind of starting a conversation.
I love that, Shalisha. You're my front row person. I used to have students who sat in the front row. They're always the first to raise their hand. So you might start with raising a question. What might the question be? 1, why does someone in a hospital have a gun? That might be a question I ask. 2, I see someone nodding. 2, do people in hospitals need guns? 3, what are the consequences of having guns inside a hospital? Right? These are all ways that we might engage with this case through the lens of allyship. Again, that piece of like raising awareness, becoming interested, building relationships with the people in the situation. You might ask questions. If this happened at Stanford Medicine, you might ask a bunch of questions because you have relationships with people and start building relationships with people, right? If you actually knew the security guards, if you actually knew the patient, if you knew the doctor, tell me what happened. Why did this happen? What is some relationship building that you could have? And you only build that relationship if you're willing to take action for equity, right? Because what we're seeing here is a huge example of inequity, right? What else might you do as an ally? I see in the chat, mental illness, understanding how patients come into the ER. Ooh, can you tell me a little bit more? Is it Eva? About mental illness? Would you just want to understand more about mental illness?
Yes, and understanding like the diagnosis and how they present in the ER so that we can better understand how to help them.
Yeah. Is it Eva? Eva, thank you. So one of the big hurdles when it comes to, and I've worked in mental health, when it comes to mental health, is that folks have this really low threshold for fear when it comes to mental health, even if the person in question is neurodiverse and not dangerous, right? We often tend to engage with neurodiversity through this lens of, I am fearing for my life. And a lot of that has to do with social stigma. I'm going to give you an example. When I started my career in mental health, I remember having personally a lot of fear around patients who would disconnect with the reality that I was sharing with other people. So I had this young person, who's like maybe 14 or 15, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And that for me, as someone who hadn't really engaged with folks who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia before, felt different and kind of uncomfortable. What happened with this patient in their particular experience of schizophrenia is that they would just hear jokes, really funny jokes that they would laugh at all the time. And until I got curious about how that showed up, and was trained on how to engage with patients who are having schizophrenic episodes, I was kind of afraid of interacting with that person. But after the training and after understanding what was happening for me, as well as for this person, they started telling me the jokes that they were hearing. And often they were actually really funny and really fun to talk about. Right. And so we have to do that raising awareness piece. You have to be willing to understand a different experience from your own, and take action. Again, training is a really good example of action. Right. What is happening for this person? What relationship do I have here that I can use to get training? How can I be humble and not think that just because there's might be a lot of stigma at play, how do I engage differently? Right. Those are all really good examples of how we apply allyship in this scenario. What are some of our barriers to allyship? Performative allyship. I'm going to pause here. Has anyone ever heard of performative allyship? Yes, no? No? I see Jeffrey like shaking your head. That is not familiar to you. Okay. Performative allyship might be new for some folks, and it is one of the biggest barriers to effective allyship and to solidarity. It's one of the reasons we transition toward thinking about solidarity as opposed to allyship. So performative allyship is based on this idea of self-gratification, and it doesn't examine your own responsibility or complicity within a community, and it can be pretty disingenuous. My favorite example of performative allyship is all through Pride Month in June, LGBTQ Pride Month. Thank you, Lane, for your comment in the chat. No, we haven't heard of performative allyship. So performative allyship is really done for social capital or for brownie points feeling good. It's done for social media, right? One of my favorite examples of performative allyship happened this Pride with Target, the store. Target has been a really big advocate for LGBTQ communities in the last few years. They've started selling chest binders for trans folks. They've started selling queer and trans owned brands in their stores. But this year, because of a conservative pushback, particularly in the American South, instead of having their Pride merchandise in the front of the store, and instead of selling some of that stuff that they started selling for trans folks, they pulled some of the stuff off the shelves and pushed all of the Pride stuff to the back of the store. That's a really good example of performative allyship. This wasn't done this wasn't done through the lens of taking action for a community that's marginalized. It was actually something that became really wobbly at the end of the day, right? If we get just a little bit of pushback, we're not going to be advocates anymore. We did this when it looked good. We did this when it made money. We did this when it was good for us as a company. And now that it's harder, we're refusing to do it anymore. We're refusing to do it in as strong a way as we were, right? And so that signals a different thing. And that also creates the need for something like solidarity. Solidarity, what is the difference? And I know some folks had put in the chat, solidarity feels different from allyship. Or we didn't know that solidarity is different from allyship, rather. So solidarity is a little bit different from allyship in that it is mutual support that uses individual power to take risk to achieve a long-term goal of collective justice. Do these feel different to you? How might they be different? Well, let's look back at this case. Let's look back at this case and see how they might be a little bit different. So if we're allies and this terrible thing happens to Alan Payan in our hospital, we might get curious and start educating ourselves on policing in hospitals. We might ask questions. We might, think about trainings. We might even do some trainings to reconsider racial bias in security. Through the lens of solidarity, what does this case look like? Solidarity changes it differently. People who are practicing solidarity in this case might actually not just advocate to get guns out of the hands of hospital security, but they might actually do long-term work to remove weapons from security altogether. This is actually quite common in a lot of EDs. I know Cleveland Clinic has their own police force on their hospital grounds. So solidarity might require more time. It would probably require a lot more risk. And it goes far past that place of just asking questions, building relationships, and being willing. When we're practicing solidarity, we're actually taking tremendous action. And it's going to take a while, right? It's going to take a while. So solidarity, there are a couple of questions that we prompted to really get us thinking about how we might evolve allyship and solidarity. And I kind of answered this question earlier. Why is this conversation important? And one of the reasons we wanted to think about the difference between allyship and solidarity is because a lot of us get stuck when it comes to allyship on that kind of early juncture of raising awareness and advocacy. And solidarity feels a little bit abstract and out of reach. So there can be stagnation in our allyship work unless we move toward a framework of solidarity. And we really want folks to engage with solidarity as something that is a more robust and deeper rooted practice of creating long-term equity and collective justice, right? Oh yeah, thank you so much, Elena, for saying that. We welcome questions in the chat. So again, feel free to send me a question directly or send Elena or Shalisha a question in the chat. Second question, how do I move from allyship to solidarity? I'm going to answer this via example. So one of my favorite examples of all time of solidarity, of allyship moving towards solidarity in the workplace was with a larger tech organization that you definitely know the name of a couple of years ago. I was working with an Asian American group of folks, and they told me that this group of Asian American women was having lunch one day at the cafeteria of their tech organization. And they were joined at some point by a group of their Black colleagues. They were friends. And one of their Black colleagues was pretty distressed. She had been badged by security on the tech campus. And that is something that she said happens to Black people on tech campuses at exponentially higher rates than it happens to other communities of color. It's actually called bias and badging. There's a whole name for it. And it means getting asked for your credentials over and over and over again. And it happens predominantly to Black and brown folks. So these Asian American women just listened to their Black colleagues talk about this really inequitable behavior. And afterward, they brainstormed and they came up with 3 offers that they could make to their Black colleagues. One, we can just listen. If you all want to have a formal listening circle, people can hear about it. 2, we can propose that we train our security guards around credentials and badging and racism in credentials and badging. And 3, we can have a conversation with leadership. And their Black colleagues eventually said the listening space wasn't really something that they wanted, but they were interested in that training. And so the Asian American woman pushed through racial bias training for security. So what does it look like through allyship? 1, you go from allyship just having the relationship. You have to have the relationship with folks who are not in your community in order to get that story in the first place, in order to listen in the first place. And then you have to be willing to act, willing to make those offers of support, right? The solidarity piece is actually pushing through security training at a giant organization of thousands and thousands. I think they had like 20,000 employees, right? The solidarity piece is pushing past that, right? And knowing that it's going to take a long time. And so that's how I think we can move from allyship to solidarity. Do we want to start with the relationship? Yes. These are, allyship and solidarity often happen on the same continuum, right? So allyship is something that requires we build a relationship so that we can listen. And solidarity is the end of that story. It took a year and a half to get those folks trained. It took brainstorming independently. It took really having these challenging conversations with leadership and taking a risk, going to leadership in the first place and saying something like, hey, security is being racist, right? So that's how we move from allyship to solidarity. We might start with a relationship. We might start with listening. We might end somewhere like racial bias training. What can you do to practice solidarity? One of the biggest challenges to solidarity that I can talk about a little bit later is this overwhelming sense of so many things being inequitable. What I really encourage folks to do is highly target one part of your day and really think about it, right? So if you are in human resources or if you're in HR and you're trying to figure out, how do I practice solidarity and allyship within what I do? Maybe you think in a really strategic way about recruitment and hiring and all of the pieces that inequity might touch in recruitment and hiring. And in recruitment, how do you recruit? Where do you recruit from? Are you looking at state schools? Are you looking at historically Black colleges and universities? Are you looking at Hispanic serving institutions, right? And once you get people, once they're recruited, are there fair ways to evaluate those folks? Do you know? Are you collecting data? Are you using interview rubrics? Are the ways that you're interviewing folks nebulous and kind of confusing, right? So one of the things we find within interviews for jobs is that folks are evaluated in personality-driven ways and bias-driven ways. Women get personality-based feedback 65% of the time. Folks are evaluated on things like vague communication. If that is applied to someone with a non-native English speaking accent, I don't know what that means. That might be an example of race-based bias, right? That might be racially loaded in some way, shape, or form. I've got a question in the chat. How do you feel regional context plays a role in biases projected in a hospital setting? What are steps we can take to shift cultural dynamics to mitigate those perceptions? For example, the dominant mindset of Palo Alto Bay Area affecting our thought processes in the hospital. Ooh, I want to know so much more about the Palo Alto Bay Area mindset affecting thought processes. And I invite this person to chime in here. I'll keep your name obviously private, but please feel free to share a little bit more about what you mean by a Bay Area thought process. I think regional context is really important, and understanding that where you are is a really big part of how we show up in terms of our biases and in terms of our solidarity is going to be really key here. I'm from the Bay Area. I was born and raised in Eastside San Jose. And I'll give you an example. What is a good example of the difference between how I think about something and how a techie thinks about something? Gentrification. Let's talk about gentrification. So one of the things I've noticed as someone who's grown up, was born and raised in the Bay Area, is that depending on where folks are from, they have a really different experience and understanding of what's happening to my community and what's happening to my neighborhood. A lot of folks who are not from here, who are migrants for tech work or highly educated migrants, will say that the Bay Area is developing, and that's a good thing. What we need is more luxury housing for the people who are migrating here, right? The other thing that they're not considering is that a lot of these communities have been rooted here for a very long time. I was born and raised here, but conspicuously, I cannot afford to live in my hometown anymore. It's too expensive for a lot of us, right? And so to me, it's not development. To me, it's being pushed out of my community. And that is a difference that I think really plays a part within a regional setting, in a regional context, right? I'm curious if that's kind of what this person is talking about. I think in terms of a hospital setting, Ooh, someone sent me a direct message. Perfect. Someone said, I think the culture of the Bay Area versus somewhere in Texas can skew perception and hence care. Oh, thank you for saying I don't need to leave you anonymous. Yeah, I actually know some folks around the clinical care setting in Stanford who experienced some friction around gender identity and gender expression, right? I think at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, even if we're from different parts of the country, what we agree on when it comes to inclusion and fairness, right? We don't necessarily have to talk about the same things. We don't necessarily have to perfectly align on the same things, but I think we do have to align on what inclusion and fairness are for both for staff, clinical care providers, and patients. As someone who's done work around inclusion and gender identity for the last decade and a half, I can tell you we've gone a lot further within inclusion for trans care providers as well as trans patients. And also we're seeing a lot more friction. And the friction comes from this idea that we disagree when I actually don't necessarily think that we disagree. I think we agree that everyone should experience the same standard of care. And I think we agree that everyone should experience a fair workplace, right? And how we get there, whether it's gender neutral pronouns and respecting someone's gender neutral pronouns in the same way that we respect their name, right? I use the right name for you, you use the right name for me, is vital, is something that we can actually agree on. And so some of that is actually around alignment, and that's irrespective of region. And I think we bring all of that, like, I'm always curious why folks feel like people from the South are so different when it comes to inclusion and belonging than people from other parts of the country, because the South is deeply committed to hospitality and fairness. So I just want us to transport those values and really understand what we share in that context. Someone else put in the chat, I've heard of ally and accomplice. Is accomplice the same as solidarity? You will hear a lot of folks say that solidarity, practicing solidarity and being an accomplice are very similar. We can see the symbiosis here between accomplice and solidarity, because an accomplice will ask that you take tremendous legal risk. Conspicuously, a lot of things have not been legal in this country that are deeply about justice and equity, like marriage between people of different races, like marriage equality generally, or integration of our schools and sharing things like restaurants and public space. And so a lot of folks will say, I want you to be an accomplice, because in a lot of ways, I think we're breaking social norms and breaking social barriers when we're practicing solidarity. So those two things are deeply related. Folks, these are great questions. Unfortunately, I think we're at the end of our time. So I'm going to hand it back to Shalisha to close us out here. Shalisha, can I just say one quick thing to answer in the chat?
Of course.
Thank you. My last question in the chat is, are there major differences between solidarity, activism, and advocacy, or all these parts of solidarity? I would say advocacy is somewhere in the beginning of your journey. It's where you're just learning. Maybe you might be interested in speaking more for a community than working alongside them. So that's maybe step one. Step two is becoming an activist, right? And again, that's the relationship of power, slightly different. You're working on behalf of a community instead of alongside them. And then solidarity is really this practice of, I'm here with you. Your inequity is something that I care deeply about, and I'm driven and motivated and centering the impacted community as opposed to my own voice. Great question. Go ahead, Shalisha. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Kim, for joining us for this important conversation today. And thank you all for listening in. Again, really want to invite you all to join our inclusion committee. And thank you, Elena, for sharing the link earlier. Also, I wanted to share a little bit more about what our inclusion committee is doing in our efforts to promote allyship and solidarity. So I just have a quick slide for you all, and also want to give a shout out to our members who have been working on this project, in particular for our NOMI board. Lisa, one of our members, helped develop a prototype so that we can get to know our colleagues, and which will foster a sense of belonging and inclusion in the workspace. Our second project is our microaggression toolkit, which is formed by our IPIDHE umbrella organization, and would help us foster more belonging in the workspace, as well as helping us navigate tricky conversations such as microaggressions. And so again, thank you so much for your time today. Feel free to reach out with any questions, feedback, as we continue to have these town halls.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Kim, for joining us and speaking to us today.
Thanks so much for having me, folks. Please do feel free to reach out if you have follow-up questions, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Bye.
Thank you.